Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. US President Donald Trump unexpectedly announced on Saturday that he had cancelled peace talks with the Taliban's major leaders at the Camp David, Maryland presidential compound after the group claimed responsibility for a Kabul attack last week that killed a US soldier and 11 other people. The United States has recalled US Special Envoy to Afghanistan Zalmay Khalilzad to Washington to chart the path forward. Asked on Sunday whether Afghan talks were dead, Pompeo said for the time being, they are. US diplomats have been talking with Taliban representatives for months about a plan to withdraw thousands of American troops in exchange for security guarantees by the Taliban. US and Taliban negotiators struck a draft peace deal last week that could have led to a drawdown in US troops from America's longest war, one of Trump's foreign policy objectives. Americans will on Wednesday mark the 18th anniversary of the Qaeda attacks that killed more than 3,000 people in New York, Washington and Pennsylvania. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the present Afghan situation and the way forward. Joining me on the program today are Alok Bansal, Director, India Foundation; Ashok Sajjanhar, former Ambassador; Rana Banerjee, former Special Secretary, Cabinet Secretariat; and Arvind Gupta, Director, Vivekananda International Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Ambassador, I'd like to begin the program with you. Your thoughts on what transpired over the weekend in the United States. First the talks were on, secret talks between, the Washington DC and Taliban, and then President Trump calling off these talks.
Yes, secret talks were on. That is what President Trump has revealed through several of his tweets on Saturday, when he said that these talks are off, because first he was going to meet at Camp David with the Taliban representatives, and then followed by that was his meeting with Ashraf Ghani, the Afghan president. So at the moment, as you mentioned yourself, the talks are off. It is not clear whether it is only for the time being, so to say, because Trump has not mentioned. But Mike Pompeo has mentioned that now the ball is in the court of the Taliban. So they are the ones who have to respond in terms of the demands that have been made by the Americans in terms of a ceasefire or whatever. So, from what it appears at the moment, because the decision seems to have been taken when one American soldier has been killed, 11 of the locals have been killed, and this blast took place very close to the American embassy in Kabul. Now, people say that so many other blasts have taken place, after all, over the last 18 years, more than 2,400 Americans have been killed. So was this being used just as a pretext by the United States, by Trump? And that is what appears to be, that this is a tactical move, because Trump was under huge pressure, and some of his own supporters amongst the conservatives, like Lindsey Graham, the Republican senator from South Carolina, he himself was pressurizing Trump that this is, such a quick exit from Afghanistan would not be advisable. Also, there was a large number of former US ambassadors, envoys, who had written to Trump that this is not the way to go forward, because the four demands, Frank, that the Americans had made, one of them was a ceasefire, complete ceasefire. Of course, the Taliban had said that they will agree to a ceasefire only after a formal agreement is reached. But what Trump held on to was that such important meeting is going to take place. So at least for in the context of generating some goodwill or whatever, these attacks could have been laid off. But that has not happened. And the other one is in terms of intra-Afghan talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And the Taliban has not agreed to that, because they said that this is a puppet government.
Right.
So there were lots of problems that were coming up. And I think the last straw on the camel's back was when the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, he refused to sign the deal at last week when it was presented to him, saying that he is not going to be agreeing to the fact that it is the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, because he thought that they would provide the front for the Islamic extremist forces to once again come and hold sway in Afghanistan.
Sure.
So I think the situation as of now is that the talks are off, but then we know that Mr. Trump has been reversing his stand also, whether it was, you know, his talks with Kim Jong-un, etc., etc. So we have to see going forward, but at least for the time being they are off, and that is a matter of satisfaction as far as we in India and of course the establishment in Afghanistan is concerned.
Absolutely, absolutely. Mr. Anand Gupta, let me come across to you now. You know, so is there more to it than meets the eye? The US establishment has categorically stated that it is the blast in Afghanistan or in Kabul that killed one US soldier and 11 others. That was the reason why the United States decided to call off the talks with the Taliban. But is there more to it?
Well, I think that could be one pretext, but the fact remains that the deal has been negotiated in the backdrop of many such attacks. And in fact, in the last few months, there have been dozens of such attacks in which a large number of people have been killed. So it seems that the deal has been negotiated in great haste, and the Taliban have got what they wanted, or they were getting what they wanted. The agreement on ceasefire was wishy-washy. There was in fact no ceasefire, and in fact that's what has been mentioned in Trump's tweet as well. And there were other aspects also which would seem that the Americans were making far too many concessions than the Taliban. For instance, there was a pressure on them from the Taliban to withdraw their troops, and some kind of a hasty timetable was being set up. There was also commitment about the US and Western countries providing assistance or continuing to provide assistance. And then of course issues like what kind of a constitution would they have, maybe a new constitution would have to be negotiated. Now all this was really going in favor of the Taliban, but not so much in favor of the Americans. So the deal was a hastily done deal, and it may not have provided the safety and the guarantee that the Taliban would not agree to their side of the bargain. And many analysts had been of the view that the deal would be probably broken as soon as it is signed, and Afghanistan could plunge into another round of violence.
Sure.
And another very important aspect of this deal making was that the Afghan government was kept out of all these negotiations, and it's only at the last moment that they were being presented with the agreement. So in a way, I think it's a good thing that the negotiations have been postponed at least. Maybe they might be resumed, we don't know. They may not be resumed, we don't know. But given the fact that Trump has been very keen that on the withdrawal of the US troops, and there is this election timetable that he has to adhere to, I have a feeling that sooner than later perhaps the talks would resume. But it's not very clear what would the Americans get which the Talibans were not prepared to give them until now.
Right.
So let us see how it goes, but for the moment it's all confusion.
Okay, for the moment it's confusion, but where does this leave Trump and his administration, Mr. Banerjee? So, you know, like the other speakers have pointed out as well, this has been high on the agenda as far as President Trump is concerned. You know, his constituents also are expecting some kind of a troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. So now that we are here, where does it leave the Trump administration?
You see, the perception had grown in the last few weeks that the discussions, as both Ambassador Sajjanhar and Dr. Gupta have pointed out, that the negotiations, 9 rounds of it with Zalmay Khalilzad, were too much in haste and too many concessions were being given to the Taliban in Zal Khalilzad's sort of quest to go down in history as a successful negotiator. So perception had grown in the State Department, in the Pentagon also, that this type of an agreement would tantamount to a surrender without adequate safeguards for basic issues like women's rights in Afghanistan, the status of the constitution, what sort of provisions, and the Taliban's unreliability, because they have also attacked three major towns, Baghlan, Kunduz and in Farah, and now the fighting has extended to Takhar as well. So they were trying to make more gains militarily even while appearing to be conciliatory in the peace talks. So this type of thing had led to a lot of pressure on President Trump that the process should not seem as a surrender. So the explosion in Kabul and the fighting that is going on has provided the peg on which the Americans have resiled, and it's sort of a rap on the knuckles to the Taliban that we won't talk to you at the moment.
Sure. So, Captain Batson, so where does it leave the Taliban? Because they have come out with some dire threats now and said that the Americans are going to pay for this and so on and so forth, because the Taliban too has worked hard to try and get this deal through.
See, to my mind, this deal was fundamentally flawed, and I have been saying so. I have actually written against it, because the whole presumption that you could create a wedge between Taliban and Al-Qaeda is actually premised on false belief, because those people who are not theologically aware, who don't understand the theological underpinnings between and linkages between Al-Qaeda and Taliban could probably hope so or dream so that there can be a difference. Because please understand, Al-Qaeda's jihad was always going to be waged under Amirul Mu'minin, who was the leader of Taliban. So if actually Taliban came to a negotiated settlement with lasting negotiated settlement with the West, then Al-Qaeda's jihad becomes delegitimized theologically. So Al-Qaeda would have never allowed this to have gone through. Probably sooner or later Americans came to realize this, and that's where you found that certain members of the establishment of certain former diplomats actually came out very strongly, because this sort of an agreement that was being signed was actually an abject surrender. You were actually undermining the authority of the Afghan government while actually elevating the status of the Taliban negotiators. Because please understand, in a tribal society, the status of people who are negotiating is considered at par. So by actually negotiating with Taliban negotiators, US was raising their status, whereas neglecting the Afghan government, the legitimate Afghan government, actually their stature was being lowered. So obviously it was actually a proposition that would not have led to a lasting peace. And the very fact that Taliban was not willing to relinquish violence also indicated that Taliban is not a monolith. So even if one faction negotiates, there may still be a faction which would continue to indulge in violence. So what are we gaining by actually undermining the authority of a legitimate government, by postponing or asking the government to postpone the elections? So everything that we could lose, we were actually getting without getting anything in return. It was only an election probably compulsion that President Trump was going for a deal like this, which to my mind was nowhere in the interest of the US in long term or the global community as far as that's concerned. The only country which probably gained out of this was Pakistan, which thought that it had probably come back to the center stage because they had all the negotiating leverage, because they were the ones who were ensuring that Taliban comes to the negotiating thing. Because who was the chief negotiator for Taliban? Mullah Baradar, who had been in Pakistan's custody for so many years. So whatever was happening was probably had probably helped Pakistan, and as a result you'll see the Pakistan's reaction has been of dismay. Actually the Pakistan's reaction is that they need to resume this negotiation as soon as possible, whereas all other countries of the world, they had apprehensions about this particular deal that was going through.
Sure. So since we are here, since you're talking about Pakistan and the other countries, what happens in Afghanistan has a direct impact on what happens in the region as well, Ambassador. So what does this mean for the region?
For the region, if we look at it, for instance, the three countries that you mentioned, as far as Afghanistan is concerned, the government has cautiously welcomed the development, because in any case, what is reported is that Ashraf Ghani himself had declined the invitation to go to Camp David for this Monday meeting, to go there on Saturday, Sunday. So, and they were very much against this deal, because as has been mentioned by, I think, Arvind and Mr. Banerjee also, that the Afghan government was really not involved in these negotiations, in these talks at all. Because the Taliban said that we are not going to negotiate with the Afghan government because that's a puppet government. So they didn't want to do anything with them. And this whole idea of the Camp David meet, which President Trump might have thought, like in 78, Jimmy Carter was able to get a Nobel Peace Prize for that. He would be able to get, Taliban, the conflicting sides, the opposing sides there, and he would be able to sort of, bring some sort of a peace agreement with that. But I don't think it was anywhere on the cards, because the Taliban has not even been willing to come to the same table where the Afghan government representatives have been there. Even when they have come, they have demanded that they should come in their personal capacity rather than as representatives of the government. So in that sense, the final point of an intra-Afghan peace accord, that was going nowhere. So the Afghans have cautiously welcomed it, that this is gone, this has become infructuous. As far as India is concerned, Afghanistan and India were the only two countries which are on the same page as far as negotiations or non-negotiations, not negotiating with the Taliban is concerned. All the other countries, initially whatever their positions might have been, whether Iran and Russia, they had worked along with India as far as the Northern Alliance was concerned in Afghanistan. But right now, both these countries, their positions had changed. Right. So India has also welcomed it. Afghan people have also welcomed it. We have sort of, cautiously welcomed it. At least the momentum of the initiative, whatever comes forward, I think we'll have to see. Whatever comes forward, but at least the momentum of the initiative has been broken. So the current situation as far as these three countries are concerned, of course, Pakistan feels hugely dismayed, because it was thinking that this will help it not only to create a sway in Afghanistan, but this will also help it to repair its fractured relations with the United States, yeah. As we saw on the 22nd of July when Imran Khan visited the White House. But if this deal doesn't go anywhere, then both these hopes are dashed.
Okay, all right. Mr. Gupta, so what does this mean for India and the legitimate government in Afghanistan? Is there any way that we can leverage or we can help propel the legitimate government in Afghanistan now?
No, we have been supporting the government of Afghanistan, and I think that is the direction in which we would probably go. But I think we have to think a little bit ahead and see now what will happen next. Will the Americans or Zalmay Khalilzad now try and restart the talks? Now, if he does that, I think that will be a very bad signal he'll be sending to the Taliban and to the rest of the world, having cancelled the meeting and called off the talks, and then you start the negotiations once again. So probably the Americans may not take initiative of restarting the talks immediately. Then will the Taliban start the discussions, or will go for negotiations? As was pointed out, I think, by Alok Bansal, that within the Taliban there are so many factions and there are so many differences. So, this whole issue might actually unravel, and there may not be discussions or resumption of talk for at least some time. If that happens, then we are back to square one, and that would of course be a good news for the Afghan government. And this presidential election which was being planned, I think that should go ahead, and we should support the holding of the elections. But certainly this kind of a deal, it is better that there is a pause, or the negotiations are not pursued further, because as my earlier panelists said, that was a complete surrender on one side.
Okay. So, Mr. Banerjee, what next? Can we expect elections anywhere in the near future? Because they were due for a long time now. Just been postponed and postponed and postponed. So, what next?
Yes, the narrative of President Ashraf Ghani that elections should go ahead has now received a fillip, though very little time remains for campaigning and for other candidates to get their act together for campaigning. And while campaigning, the threat of violence from the Taliban will very much be a deterrent for an effective campaign. Nevertheless, the options are perhaps not there for any other development. There will be more violence resorted to by the Taliban, and the Afghan government will have to cope with that sort of violence. There will be fallout on civilian casualties. But more than that, you see, the factionalism within the Taliban could also intensify. Mullah Baradar is a figurehead. The Pakistanis don't trust him. But there are other negotiators, Stanekzai Abbas Stanekzai and Shahabuddin Dilawar. These are the main people who are completely under the influence of the ISI, and the two decision makers in the Taliban, Mullah Akhundzada, Haibatullah Akhundzada himself, and Sirajuddin Haqqani. So, to what extent they can be marginalized in their demands? The problem is that some of the field commanders who have been actually involved in the fighting in Helmand and Kunduz, they are very much advocating for further, consolidation of their military gains on the ground. So this is a pressure which acts on the Taliban, and the Pakistanis are placed in a peculiar cleft stick. They have to show to the Americans that, oh, they are trying to influence the Taliban to become more reasonable, to hold on to, their military gains and not press home the advantage, etc. But that's only a notional posture. Basically, they are very happy with whatever gains on the ground the Taliban make. So this is a setback to them temporarily. But as everybody feels, this is an uncertain situation. How long it continues remains to be seen. Even the Americans would ultimately veer around to a position of trying to resume the talks, because if the Taliban gives some semblance of a peace initiative or something, of adhering to a peace initiative or showing some sincerity to meet some of the demands that have been made, then I think again there will be a resumption of the talks process.
Okay, so I think we are in agreement that we are going to see a brief lull, at least for the time being, in the near future as far as Afghanistan and the situation there is concerned. So Captain Bansal, does it give all the players a chance to regroup and redraw their strategies, and whom is it going to benefit, this kind of back to square one kind of a situation?
Yeah, I think the players who will benefit the most is, of course, the government of Ashraf Ghani. If they go ahead with the elections, it will be very, very significant. Because please understand, the day Afghan populace realize that power can be changed through the ballot, Taliban will lose a huge amount of its support. Because Taliban's one of the main campaigning strategy has been saying that Afghanistan is under foreign occupation and the government is actually a puppet government. Now, if actually a proper election, unfortunately the last presidential election was not free of controversy, so it did not give that sort of a confidence to the populace. Now, if the common man realizes that the government can be changed, that the ruler can be changed by the ballot, and then he would not have this sort of, he would probably not buy into the Taliban propaganda that it's a US government and puppet government is ruling there. And I think even for countries like India and all, which have realized that a Taliban notional victory in Afghanistan will actually trigger instability all around the region, because one must understand that the Taliban is no longer going to be ideologically confined to the geographical frontiers of Afghanistan today. They are too far closely aligned with the global Islamic movement, and they would like to push their ideology. They would like to export their ideology into this particular region. So to my mind, negotiating with Taliban is going to be infructuous. But since there is an election in US coming, maybe before the election, the president may like to go through some notions of starting the negotiations so that he gets some votes. But if no deal is struck by the next elections, you would see it getting delayed. And if that gets delayed, it's quite feasible that there can be fractures which are there within Taliban might come into the open. And we are already seeing that IS in Afghanistan is making a huge presence felt.
Yes.
So there is already negotiations with Taliban will not ensure that there will be complete peace. So you have problems, and I think sustaining and strengthening Ashraf Ghani's government is actually, or the legitimate government, whichever gets elected after the elections, would be the right strategy for the international community. And government of India should continue its support to the legitimate government. We have been actually in the forefront. Maybe we could get other countries also on board to support and sustain the legitimate government in Afghanistan.
All right, quick closing comments from all my guests now. I'm going to ask you to be brief. You've got limited time on the program, on the best way forward as far as Afghanistan is concerned. Ambassador, starting with you.
I'll maybe take the position as far as India is concerned. What's the best way, what is And I would say that, enhance our connect, our interaction, our collaboration with the Afghan government, with Ashraf Ghani, because that is what we've been doing. And I think also as far as the regional players are concerned, two aspects. One, why did the Russians started negotiating with the Taliban? Because they thought that they could collaborate with Taliban to act against the Islamic State, and that we see doesn't seem to be sort of standing the test of time. When Prime Minister Modi was in Vladivostok, I think the sort of discussions that did take place in terms of having, ensuring a political mandate for whatever comes forward, constitutional legitimacy, having stability, and as the expression was used, not leaving any empty spaces for terror to thrive in. I think these are the sort of things that we need to work with all the partners, because
Right.
I think all of them are really interested in stability and in peace. So I think India also needs to enhance its political engagement,
Sure.
not only with the Afghan government but also with the regional parties, and also see because Taliban is becoming a fact on the ground.
Right.
At this moment, the control in Afghanistan that they have is the highest in terms of territory
Space.
controlled
Yeah.
by them than it has ever had since 2001.
Sure.
So I think how do we need to engage with the Taliban, if at all?
Okay, all right. Mr. Gupta?
Well, I think the lesson of all this is that the deal was flawed because it was being negotiated by only two parties. And the Afghan government, which is a legitimate party, was being kept out. Now, if there is some rethinking on how to restructure the negotiations, then we should get more parties on the table. Now, this may not be acceptable to the Taliban, but I think insofar as India is concerned, we should certainly push for an inclusive dialogue and inclusive negotiations, which should include the Afghan government, which is very much a legitimate player in all this. And at the same time, I think we should also now start talking to the other regional players and try and make sure that, or at least persuade them that they also support the Afghan government. You see, what had happened was that almost everybody had started in some way or the other, started accepting the Taliban, having some kind of dealings with the Taliban, etc., which they had emboldened them. I think that should be avoided. So India should show solidarity with the current Afghan government, should go ahead with support the holding of the presidential elections, and should support inclusive negotiations. And if possible, actually we should go back to what happened in 2001 when the negotiations were held under the UN auspices and there was a wider legitimacy.
Right.
This kind of two parties, US and Taliban talking, this doesn't have a wider legitimacy.
All right. Mr. Banerjee?
Well, for the short term, I would just confine the suggestion for the American forces to give more consolidated support for air support operations to the existing Afghan National Security Forces while the elections are being conducted.
All right. And Captain Bansal, close the show for us with your concluding remarks.
See, to my mind, I think government of India, a lot of people were talking in terms of negotiating with Taliban. I personally feel we may open probably communication lines, but we must avoid talking to Taliban because that strengthens them and actually weakens the government. We must strengthen our connect, which we already have a very strong connect with Afghanistan, Afghan people and Afghan government. We must strengthen, I think, build up the capacity of Afghan National Army, because that is the instrument of the Afghanistan government which will eventually determine what finally emerges. And I think we must impress upon the regional players and the global players, mainly the US, Russia and China, that negotiating with Taliban will never bring in peace. I think that fact must be understood very clearly.
Certainly. All right. On that note, then we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.